There's a pattern running through history like a hidden script. And every time a superpower starts reading from it, the ending is always the same. 3 times in the last 500 years, a dominant empire has collapsed. Not stumbled, not declined gracefully. Collapsed. And right now, in 2025, the United States is walking through that same pattern. Stage by stage, decision by decision, as if we've stolen the exact screenplay that destroyed every global hegemon before us. In 1590, Spain was the wealth engine of the world. They held roughly half the planet's gold and silver. Their galleons ruled the seas, their armies dominated Europe, and their silver coin, the real de a ocho, functioned as the closest thing the early modern world had to a reserve currency. 80 years later, they were bankrupt so many times that the word default became part of their political identity. The empire never truly recovered. It decayed in slow motion and then froze in place, a second-rate power clinging to memories of glory. In 1914, Britain presided over the largest empire in human history. The cliché was true. The sun never set on British territory. The pound sterling was trusted everywhere. Global trade contracts were priced in pounds. Central banks hoarded British bonds the way they hoard US treasuries today. 4 decades later, the empire was gone. The pound had lost its crown. Britain became the junior partner in someone else's order, America's. In 1991, the Soviet Union still looked, on paper, like the other pole of global power. A vast military, an empire of satellite states across Eastern Europe, a superpower that terrified the world. And then, in just 900 days, it ceased to exist. No foreign invasion, no nuclear war. It was erased by something more mundane and more relentless. Economic implosion. 3 times. 3 superpowers. 3 collapses. Different ideologies, different cultures, different centuries, but the same underlying sequence. And here's the part that should make the hair on your neck stand up. The United States has already passed 5 of the 7 stages in that sequence. We're not at risk of entering the pattern. We're already deep inside it. This is the story of how empires actually die. Why they always believe they're immune while it's happening, and why the math, not the politics, says we're next. And it's happening faster than anyone in power is willing to admit. What imperial collapse really looks like. When we think of an empire falling, we picture the dramatic scenes. Enemy armies breaching the capital, flags torn down, a final battle. But that's almost never how it begins. Imperial collapse doesn't start with invasion. It starts with exhaustion. The empire slowly pushes beyond what its economy can sustain. Military bases sprawled across the world. Obligations to defend dozens of allies. Wars on multiple fronts, sometimes hot, sometimes forever wars of occupation and influence. Welfare promises, pension promises, debt promises. At first, everything still appears fine. The currency works. The military wins battles. The government keeps signing new checks. Politicians keep promising that growth will cover it all. But beneath the surface, the foundation starts to crack. Resources are misallocated. Manufacturing and productive capacity wither. The economy tilts away from making things and toward pushing paper, managing debt, and speculating on assets. The ambitious and the talented quietly leave for other countries or simply for private, insulated lives. Then the decline speeds up. Allies, sensing vulnerability, begin to hedge their bets. They deepen ties with rivals. They diversify their reserves. Enemies test the empire's limits, probing in small ways first, then bolder and bolder. Trade partners search for alternatives to the empire's currency. The status of global reserve currency starts to erode at the edges. Not overnight, not with a proclamation, but through 100 bilateral deals and quiet policy shifts. The financial logic that once made the empire untouchable reverses itself. The currency, once demanded worldwide, begins returning home. The massive military, once a symbol of unstoppable reach, becomes a drain on resources. The promises that were once backed by undisputed strength start to look like fantasy. This is not theoretical. This is exactly what happened to Spain, Britain, and the Soviet Union, each in their own way, each at their own speed. They all made the same fatal assumptions. They believed their dominance was permanent. They overextended their militaries, they debased their currency, or crippled its credibility. They refused to adjust, even as the numbers stopped adding up. By the time collapse became visible, it was already too late. The 7-stage pattern. When you zoom out, a repeating pattern emerges. The language changes, the uniforms change, the flags change, but the sequence is eerily consistent. Military overextension. The empire spreads itself across continents, fighting wars, maintaining bases, promising security to everyone, until the burden exceeds its real economic strength. Currency debasement or credibility collapse. To fund this overreach, the empire distorts its money by diluting precious metals, breaking gold promises, or printing fiat currency at scale. Debt spiral borrowing becomes permanent. Old debts are rolled into new ones. Interest grows faster than the underlying economy. Loss of productive capacity. The empire stops making things. It imports more than it exports. It becomes dependent on others for essentials. Social decay, inequality rises. Trust falls. Institutions rot. Crime, addiction, and disillusionment spread. Optimism dies. Loss of reserve currency status, strategic position trade shifts into other currencies. Allies diversify. The empire's money and influence are no longer mandatory. They're optional. Collapse. Not a gentle slope, but a cliff. Currency crisis, debt crisis, political crisis in rapid succession. What looked eternal becomes historical. Spain followed this pattern, Britain followed this pattern, the Soviet Union followed this pattern, and America right now has already checked off the first 5 boxes. We'll come back to that. But first, you need to see how the pattern unfolded the first time. When the modern world's original global empire discovered that controlling the world's money and metals doesn't make you invincible. It makes you fragile. The first blueprint, Spain, 1500 to 1700. After Columbus opened the Atlantic route in 1492, Spain didn't just stumble into power. It became the prototype for the global empire. They crushed the Aztec and Inca civilizations. They seized control of the richest gold and silver mines the world had ever seen, especially the silver mountain of Potosi in modern Bolivia and the mines of Mexico. By the mid-1500s, Spanish galleons were bringing home around 200 tons of silver every year. By 1600, that number rose to over 400 tons. No one had ever controlled that much monetary metal. Spanish silver became the default international currency. Merchants from Europe to Asia wanted it. Taxes, trade, and war all revolved around it. Spain didn't just participate in the global economy, it anchored it. And that's exactly where the pattern begins. With a country that controls the world's money and convinces itself that this makes it untouchable. King Philip II, ruling from 1556 to 1598, sat atop more wealth than any monarch in history had ever seen. And he did what empires always do when they mistake cash flow for invincibility. He spent it on everything, everywhere, all at once. That's stage 1, military overextension. And in Spain's case, it would become the opening act of a slow-motion catastrophe. When Spain reached its peak in the mid-1500s, it looked unstoppable. It held continents, gold fleets, and a currency trusted from Antwerp to Beijing. But beneath the surface, the empire had already begun reading from the same script that would later destroy Britain, the Soviet Union, and now threatens the United States. Spain is the first full blueprint, the prototype. Every empire afterward simply replayed its choices under new costumes. Let's break down Spain's fall exactly as it unfolded, stage by stage. Stage 1. Military overextension. Fighting everywhere, winning nowhere. Spain believed its wealth guaranteed victory. So, it fought everywhere. Ottoman Empire in the Mediterranean, France and Italian states, Dutch rebels in the Netherlands, England's navy on the open sea wars in the Philippines, Caribbean, Central America, South America. By 1580, Spain had active military commitments across 4 continents. Spain's armies were legendary, but armies burn money like fire consumes oxygen. By Philip II's reign, over half of Spain's entire revenue went to the military, and yet Spain couldn't stop. Prestige required expansion. Rivals demanded resistance. Empire demanded maintenance. This is the same trap the US faces today. When strategic commitments multiply faster than economic strength, collapse becomes a matter of time, not possibility. Stage 2. Currency. Debasement. Silver without silver, Spain's rulers insisted the empire was wealthy because they had gold. But in reality, Spain had spending power, not productive power. And spending power is fragile. When military costs exploded, taxes couldn't keep up. So Spain turned to the oldest economic trick in the imperial playbook. Debase the currency. Spanish mints began mixing copper into silver coins, First 10% copper, then 30%, then 50%, eventually 75% or more. On the surface, the money looked the same. In reality, its value was collapsing. Merchants grew suspicious. Trade partners demanded pure silver, not Spanish coin. Inflation ripped through the economy. It was the 16th century version of what America is now doing through quantitative easing and deficit spending, increasing the money supply faster than real production grows. Different tools, same outcome. Stage 3, debt spiral, when band-aids become permanent. As Spain's spending soared and its currency weakened, it turned to the new banking powers of Europe, especially wealthy German and Italian lenders. Spain began borrowing massively. And then came the breaking point: 1557, first bankruptcy; 1560, second bankruptcy; 1575, third bankruptcy; 1596, fourth bankruptcy. 4 defaults in less than 40 years. Each time Spain swore it would reform. Each time it went right back to borrowing for wars it couldn't afford. Defaults didn't reset the system. They hardened it. Lenders charged more interest. Spain borrowed more to pay the new interest. And the empire became trapped in a loop. This is exactly what modern governments do today. Borrow to service old debt, not to build the future. That is not financing. That is slow-motion drowning. Stage 4, loss of productive capacity. The golden curse. Spain's fall reveals a truth every empire eventually learns. Having too much money destroys your ability to make money. With silver galleons arriving every year, Spain no longer needed domestic agriculture, domestic manufacturing, domestic innovation, domestic industry of any kind. Why grow wheat when it's easier to import it? Why build ships when the Dutch will happily sell them? Why innovate when raw money gives an illusion of eternal power? Spain became the ultimate consumer empire. Wealth flowed through Spain, but never stayed in Spain. Spanish nobles viewed work as beneath them. Merchants and engineers left for countries where productivity was valued: France, England, the Netherlands. By 1600, Spain, the richest empire on earth, was producing almost nothing. Its entire economy depended on a single resource: silver. But silver mines do not last forever. By the early 1600s, production declined, shipments slowed, costs rose, and the entire imperial economy, built on imported goods and foreign borrowing, began to collapse. This stage is almost identical to America today. Manufacturing outsourced supply chains. Foreign imports exceed exports by enormous margins. Money replaces production, consumption replaces industry. Spain didn't lose its empire because it lacked silver. It lost because silver allowed it to stop working. Stage 5. Social decay. The people always sense collapse first. Economic decline is invisible at first, but social decay is not. By the late 1500s and early 1600s, crime exploded, beggars filled the streets, youth unemployment soared, prices rose faster than wages, corruption flourished. Skilled workers emigrated, public morale collapsed. Spain became a society of officials, priests, aristocrats, and soldiers, but no creators. Productive people left or died. Unproductive people multiplied. This is how societies hollow out. By 1640, Spain lost Portugal. By 1650, it lost control of the Netherlands, its wealthiest region. By 1700, the Spanish Empire was large on maps but hollow in reality, a paralyzed colossus. Spain went from world ruler to historical footnote in less than a century. And here's the warning: Spain's collapse didn't look like a sudden explosion. It looked like a long, slow draining of vitality. Exactly what we see in the United States today: institutional mistrust, division, addiction, violence, declining life expectancy, falling birth rates, a culture of consumption without creation. We're not waiting for collapse to begin. We are living through its middle stages. But Spain was only the first example. Next came an empire far larger, wealthier, and more global, the British Empire. And it followed the same script, step by step. Spain was the prototype. Britain was the industrial strength replay, bigger, richer, more sophisticated, but ultimately trapped by the same mathematical forces. By the early 1900s, the British Empire covered 25% of the planet. 400 million people lived under its flag. London was the world's financial capital. The pound sterling was the global reserve currency. Every central bank from Buenos Aires to Bombay held British bonds. For a moment, Britain really was the center of the world. But once again, The seven-stage pattern had already begun, decades before anyone realized the empire was dying. Stage 1. Military overextension, an empire too large to defend. By 1900, Britain had garrisons, naval bases, and colonial troops stationed everywhere. India, Egypt, South Africa, Canada, Hong Kong, Singapore, Caribbean colonies, Pacific Islands, Middle East protectorates. They were defending territory on 6 continents. An empire that enormous doesn't rest on naval power, it rests on money, oceans of it. Every outpost needed supplies, every colony required administrative staff. Every trade route needed ships, forts, and constant military readiness. Even before World War I, Britain was spending beyond sustainability. But the empire still looked strong from the outside, just like America looks strong today. That illusion would not survive the 20th century. Stage 2. Currency debasement, but more sophisticated. The fall of the pound. Before the 20th century, Britain's strength came from one key fact. The pound sterling was backed by gold and believed to be unshakable. But World War I was the most expensive conflict humanity had ever seen up to that point. Britain had 2 choices: stay neutral and preserve the empire, enter the war and bankrupt itself to win. They chose war and paid a price they could never recover from. To finance the war, Britain printed money, borrowed massively, especially from the US, drained its gold reserves. By 1918, Britain had become a debtor nation for the first time since the Middle Ages. Instead of accepting this reality, the British government made a fatal error. They tried to restore the pound to its pre-war value. In 1925, under Winston Churchill, then Chancellor of the Exchequer, Britain repegged the pound to gold at the old rate, a rate far too high for the weakened post-war economy. The result? British exports became overpriced, factories shut down, unemployment soared. Miners struck, the British economy suffocated under its own currency policy. This was Britain's version of Spain, mixing copper into silver coins. The method was different. The effect was identical. The currency died because the empire tried to defend the illusion of old strength. By 1931, they were forced off the gold standard. The pound collapsed 25% overnight. When Britain admitted the pound was no longer what it claimed to be, the world understood what Britain would not say out loud. The empire was already finished. Stage 3. Debt spiral. War is the graveyard of empires. Most people think Britain collapsed after World War II. Wrong. Britain collapsed during World War I. World War II simply finished the job. After 1918, Britain was already drowning in debt. Then they spent decades pretending they were still rich. When World War II began, the empire once again chose to fight. Once again they printed money, borrowed massively, and drained their reserves. By 1945, Britain owed the United States, Canada, private American banks, its own colonies, and dozens of other lenders over $30 billion, more than its entire GDP. It took Britain 61 years to finish repaying just one of the US war loans. They made the final payment in 2006. Let that sink in. The empire that once controlled the earth finished paying for World War II during the iPhone era. No empire survives debt like that. Stage 4. Loss of empire. The world shrinks overnight after World War II. Britain could no longer defend its colonies, finance their development, maintain global infrastructure, sustain the Royal Navy project power abroad. It wasn't a debate. The math was undeniable. So Britain began abandoning the empire. 1947. India and Pakistan gain independence. 1956. Suez Crisis shows the world Britain is powerless without the US. 1960s. African colonies leave 1980s. Hong Kong prepares for handover. By 1970, the empire existed only in nostalgia and history books. Rome declined slowly, Spain declined over a century, Britain declined in 1 generation. Economic collapse is faster now because the world is more interconnected, just like the US today. Stage 5. Currency. Collapse, the pound returns to earth. The pound sterling, once the global reserve currency, began a long decline. Look at this brutal historical trend. 1940, 1 403, 1950, 1 280, 1970, 1 240, 1985, 1 105 today, 121, 127, a regional currency, not a global anchor. Britain still has nuclear weapons, still has a seat on the UN Security Council, still has influence. But everyone knows the truth. Britain is a former superpower, living in the shadow of the nation that replaced it. Once a currency loses reserve status, the empire that issued it loses everything that mattered. Spain learned it, Britain learned it, the Soviet Union learned it, and now the United States stands at the same precipice. But to understand America's present, we must examine the most recent example, the Soviet Union, because it shows how fast collapse happens in the modern era. If Spain was the first blueprint and Britain was the imperial industrial version, the Soviet Union was the modern version. The collapse that happened in real time, with cameras rolling, satellites watching, and economists unable to explain how a superpower could disintegrate faster than most corporations. For 45 years after World War II, the USSR stood as one of two global hegemons. It built nuclear weapons, landed satellites in space, controlled half of Europe, and projected power from Cuba to Afghanistan. To most of the world, the Soviet Union looked monolithic, a steel colossus capable of enduring forever. But beneath the propaganda, the same pattern was unfolding. Military commitments far beyond economic capacity, currency dysfunction, debt and resource strain. Collapse of productive industry, rapid loss of sphere of influence, sudden political implosion. The Soviet Union did not lose the Cold War. It died of the same mathematical disease that killed Spain and Britain. Let's break down its collapse step by step. Stage 1. Military overextension. Spending economic blood to match the US. The Soviet Union's fatal mistake was trying to equal and surpass the United States militarily, while having only a fraction of America's economic strength. Consider the raw numbers. The USSR spent 15 to 20% of its GDP on the military. The US spent 5 to 6%, sometimes less Soviet military personnel. 5 million bases and alliances across Eastern Europe, Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Endless proxy wars, Afghanistan, Angola, Vietnam, Korea, Ethiopia. The Soviet model required projecting influence everywhere the US had interests. For every move America made, the USSR had to match it. But there was a foundational problem. You cannot outspend your rival when your economy is a fraction of theirs. The USSR was trying to run a marathon at sprint speed. By the late 1970s, the Soviet military had become a black hole for resources. Tanks they couldn't afford to maintain, missiles rusting in silos, soldiers' unpaid equipment, outdated logistics collapsing. The Soviet Union looked strong militarily, but only if you ignored the economy supporting it. This is the same trap the United States faces now, a military footprint that no longer matches the underlying economic engine. Stage 2. Economic stagnation. When the engine stops turning. The Soviet economy was massive, but hollow. On the surface, it produced steel, tanks, rockets, and industrial goods in unbelievable quantities. But quantity isn't prosperity. Here's what was happening. Factories produced low-quality products nobody wanted. Central planning made innovation impossible. The best engineers left for better pay or better freedom. Farms failed, despite having some of the richest land on Earth. The USSR had to import grain from the United States, its rival. Every year, productivity fell further behind the West. By the 1980s, Soviet GDP growth had slowed to almost zero. Worse, the only thing keeping the Soviet economy afloat was oil. When oil prices crashed in 1985, the USSR's lifeline was cut. This moment, the oil price collapse, was the Soviet version of Spain's silver decline and Britain's post-war debt crisis. Every empire has a moment where the resource that sustains it evaporates. For the USSR, that moment came quickly and brutally. Stage 3, currency collapse, a money system. No one trusted. The ruble was not a global currency. It wasn't even fully trusted inside the Soviet Union. Citizens hoarded US dollars whenever possible. Why? Because the ruble was not convertible internationally, was backed by nothing, could not purchase foreign goods, was subject to arbitrary government control, lost purchasing power constantly. Meanwhile, the Soviet government needed foreign currency, dollars, marks, yen, to buy food, technology, machinery, and grain. They couldn't print dollars. They had to buy them with oil-gold borrowing. When oil crashed and gold reserves dwindled, the USSR simply ran out of real money. This is a warning for the US today. When your currency stops being trusted globally, collapse goes from slow to sudden. Stage 4. Loss of empire. The geopolitical fabric rips open. The Soviet Empire didn't collapse gradually, it snapped. The sequence, 1989, Poland breaks free. Hungary follows Czechoslovakia, Romania, Bulgaria, East Germany. The Berlin Wall, the symbol of Soviet dominance, fell in a single weekend. Entire regions that had been under Soviet control for 45 years slipped away in months. The USSR could do nothing. Why? They were broke. They could not maintain the empire militarily or financially. This is identical to Spain losing Portugal and the Netherlands, Britain losing India and Africa, Rome losing its provinces. Empires don't shrink by choice. They shrink because they can no longer afford the cost of holding territory. Stage 5, complete collapse. A superpower vanishes from the fall of the Berlin Wall to the dissolution of the USSR took just 900 days. That is what a modern collapse looks like. Fast, chaotic, final. By 1991, the government couldn't pay the military. The ruble became worthless, factories shut down, GDP fell 40%, lifespans plunged. Entire regions faced starvation, 15 new countries emerged from the wreckage. A superpower that once terrified Washington ceased to exist, without a single foreign army invading Moscow. Collapse came from within. But here's the part that matters most. The Soviet Union collapsed after completing only 5 of the 7 stages. America has already completed those same 5. The Soviet Union never reached reserve currency loss because it never had reserve currency privilege. It skipped straight to stage 7, implosion. The United States, however, is the world's reserve currency. That means the next 2 stages, stage 6 and stage 7, will be far more dramatic. And now, with historical patterns clear, we turn to the part that matters most, where America stands today, and why the pattern says the collapse has already begun. Now we arrive at the part no one in Washington, Wall Street, or the Pentagon wants to confront. The United States is not at risk of following the imperial collapse pattern. It is already deep inside it. Spain completed the pattern. Britain completed the pattern. The Soviet Union completed the pattern. And the United States, right now, has crossed 5 of the 7 stages, the same 5 that led every previous superpower to ruin. This isn't ideology. This isn't opinion. This is math plus history, repeating with ruthless precision. Let's walk through the American reality, stage by stage, and then look at the final 2 stages that lie directly ahead. Stage 1, military overextension, the empire that can't say no. The United States has 750-plus military bases, overseas troops in 150 countries, security commitments through NATO, ANZUS, US-Japan Treaty, and dozens more carrier groups in almost every ocean, permanent deployments in Europe, the Middle East, Africa, and the Pacific, a military budget of $850 billion, larger than the next 10 countries combined. That sounds impressive on a PowerPoint slide. But here's the uncomfortable truth. The United States has more commitments than it can realistically defend at once. If China moved on Taiwan, and Russia escalated in Eastern Europe, and Iran sparked conflict in the Gulf, America does not have the military or industrial capacity to fight all 3 simultaneously. Recruitment is collapsing. Equipment is aging. Stockpiles are shrinking. Shipbuilding capacity is decades behind China. Supply chains rely on foreign manufacturing, including from rivals. This is the same trap Spain, Britain, and the USSR fell into. Empire continues expanding, while economic strength quietly erodes underneath. Check. Stage 2. Currency debasement, dollar printing on a historic scale. Spain diluted silver. Britain overvalued the pound. The Soviets printed worthless rubles. The US does something more sophisticated, but identical in effect. Print dollars faster than the underlying economy can absorb. Since 1971, when Nixon ended gold convertibility, the dollar has lost 98% of its purchasing power. But the real shock starts in the 2000s. Money supply up 400%, national debt up 500%, post-2020 stimulus, $6 trillion created almost instantly, Fed balance sheet exploded past $8 trillion. This is currency debasement in digital form. The world still accepts dollars today, but only because there has been no alternative strong enough to replace it. That is changing, fast, check. Stage 3. Debt spiral, the point of no return. Here is the most critical number in the American collapse. $36 trillion national debt, $1 trillion per year. In interest, America now pays more in interest than defense, veterans affairs, transportation, education. Interest is the largest, fastest growing expense the government has, and it's growing exponentially. Worse, America borrows money to pay interest on previous borrowing. That is not managing finances. That is the definition of a debt spiral. Spain defaulted 4 times. Britain borrowed until the empire imploded. The USSR simply ran out of usable money. America is on the same trajectory, but on a far larger scale. Check. Stage 4. Loss of productive capacity, the empire of imports. The US economy is world-class in innovation, finance, and technology, but hollow in production. Consider this. The US imports $800+ billion more than it exports every year. 97% of antibiotics are sourced from abroad. 70% of microchips from Taiwan. Electronics, steel, energy components, imported. Even the US military buys materials from China. This is identical to Spain in the 1600s. Their silver flowed outward as they imported everything. The US dollar flows outward as we import everything. Both empires believed money could substitute for manufacturing. Both were wrong. When a crisis hits, money is useless without production. Check. Stage 5. Social decay. The rot from within. This is the stage where every empire starts pretending nothing is wrong. Look around America. Trust in institutions at historic lows. Crime rising in major cities, mental illness and addiction, exploding 100,000+ drug overdose deaths annually, homeless encampments in every major metro, fertility rates collapsing. Political polarization at civil war levels, infrastructure degrading. Life expectancy falling for the first sustained period in modern history. This is exactly what Spain, Britain, and the USSR looked like in their final decades. A society losing confidence in itself, while leaders insist everything is fine. Check. The final 2 stages where America is heading. Next, every empire that reached stage 5 eventually hit stage 6, and once they crossed that line, collapse came quickly. Stage 6. Loss of reserve currency status. The US dollar is the foundation of American power. Lose that, and the empire ends overnight. For the first time since 1945, signs of unraveling are visible. BRICS countries launching dollar alternatives, China and Russia trading in yuan, rubles, Saudi Arabia, accepting yuan for oil, central banks buying gold at record rates. Dollar share of global reserves falling steadily, nations cutting exposure to US debt. This shift is slow, until suddenly it isn't. Once countries no longer need dollars for trade, they stop holding US treasuries. When they stop holding treasuries, they start selling them. And when trillions of dollars in reserves come flooding back home, inflation, interest rates, borrowing costs, everything breaks at once. This is Britain in 1931. This is Spain when silver shipments dried up. This is the USSR when oil collapsed. It's the trigger point, and America is inching closer each year. Stage 7. Collapse. Fast, not slow. Here is what collapse actually looks like in a modern superpower. Treasury markets seize. The dollar falls sharply. Interest rates spike, banks become insolvent, pensions evaporate. Social programs fail, military funding collapses, states revolt against federal mandates, the political system fractures, GDP contracts violently, allies abandon the US, strategic influence vanishes. This is not a movie. This is what happened to the USSR in under 3 years. This is what happened to Britain in under 20 years. Spain took longer, only because the global system was slower in the 1600s. Collapse today is brutal and accelerated. Once stage 6 begins, stage 7 follows rapidly. And the United States, the most indebted empire in human history, is positioned for a collapse larger and faster than any before it. This time is different. The lie. Every empire tells Spain believed it was exceptional. Britain believed its empire was eternal. The Soviets believed their ideology guaranteed success. Every empire insists, we're different. It can't happen here. We have technology. We have the greatest military. We have the reserve currency. And every empire is proven wrong. The pattern doesn't care about flags. It doesn't care about pride. It doesn't care about belief. Empires collapse because math wins, and math doesn't negotiate. The United States is not immune. It is not special. It is not an exception to 5 centuries of economic law. For the first time, America is sprinting through the pattern, faster than Spain, faster than Britain, faster even than the USSR. The timing is uncertain. The sequence is not. Maybe America has a decade, maybe 5 years, maybe less. But history is clear. Empires don't decline slowly. They fall suddenly, violently, when the final stages trigger in rapid succession. If you want to understand what happens next, when the dollar weakens, when the debt becomes unpayable, when global power shifts, you must study the past, not the future, because everything America is about to face Spain faced it, Britain faced it, the Soviet Union faced it, and the pattern says the United States is next.